Thank you, Joseph. Good morning from the UK and good afternoon to you in Asia Pacific and beyond. Thank you, firstly, to Joseph and his team for organising this really amazing conference and inviting me to speak today on child justice in ASEAN. My name is Jennie Williams. I am an associate with Embode. We are an independent consulting organisation working in Asia Pacific and in Africa on multiple projects in multiple fields, including corporate sustainability, responsibility, child labour, gender, and counter-trafficking, amongst others. So this project is on child justice in ASEAN. It was in partnership with ASEAN Act and funded by Australian Aid. And I am the manager and regional coordinator for this project. So the objective of the project was to support the design and delivery of capacity development needs relevant to protection of child rights in the justice system, specifically relating to counter-trafficking activities in 7 ASEAN member states. But it wasn't just a critical analysis. It was looking at best practices as well in order for these to be identified and replicated and upscaled. We then created recommendations and national and regional capacity strengthening frameworks. And so the purpose of the presentation today is to look at the methodology that we devised and implemented. I just then want to go over a couple of the capacity needs that we identified. But then I really want to take some time to discuss the recommendations and the technical areas that we identified that required some strengthening. So looking firstly at the design and methodology, we adopted, of course, a child-focused and rights-based approach. And what we wanted to do then was try and look at the justice system through the eyes of the child. So starting from when they came first into contact with someone within the judicial system, whether that's the immigration, police, or social workers, and then follow that journey through from identification through to trial. And the tools that we designed were to assess awareness, knowledge, attitudes, and practices of 4 criminal justice stakeholder groups. The first was government and policy makers. Second was law enforcement. So we looked at police officers and immigration officers. Third was the judiciary, and this included prosecutors and judges. The fourth was support and referral services, both government and non-governmental. And we also allowed room to identify and encourage the participation of adult survivors of child trafficking. And of course, we ensured all ethical requirements were fulfilled. This, unfortunately, was not able to access them from all countries, but from some. And they provided some critical insights. So the capacity of the 4 stakeholder groups were assessed at 3 levels. The first was on an individual professional level. The second was institutional and organizational, looking at systemic practices. And also the interagency and interorganization. How do the stakeholder groups refer cases and coordinate and collaborate with each other? So we undertook 4 key steps. The first was a legislative review. And again, although we focused on a gap analysis, we also looked at where they were adhering to regional and international obligations. A knowledge, attitudes and practices, or a CAP survey. Key informant interviews from each of those stakeholder groups. And then the findings, once they'd been analysed and confirmed, we then held national validation workshops with each of the countries both with government and non-governmental, and these were held in January this year. Those validations and also any other key insights were then incorporated into the final report. So there were 7 countries in ASEAN that participated in this assessment, and I'm just going to go through them and explain about the sites and the data that was captured. So firstly, Cambodia. Now, initially, because this was a contained, limited project, we were only going to go for 2 sites, looking at approximately 20 key informant interviews or KIIs, and around 50 CAP surveys. So first of all, sometimes that wasn't able. We had to keep the methodology flexible. As you know, COVID is the gift that keeps on giving. And so that created some challenges for us. So we had to be flexible. So Cambodia, we were able to access Phnom Penh, Poi Phet, Siem Reap, and Koh Kong. We managed to achieve 24 KIIs and 59 CAP surveys. Indonesia was Jakarta and West Kalimantan, and we achieved 27 KIIs and 70 CAP surveys. Lao PDR was Vientiane and Savannah Ket with 21 KIIs and 50 CAP surveys. Myanmar was a literature review only, and I'll explain in the next slide as to why. The Philippines was Metro Manila, Davao, and Albay with 23 KIIs and 117 CAP surveys. Thailand was Bangkok and in Nakhon Ratchasima with 22 KIIs and 106 CAP surveys. And Vietnam was Hanoi, Lao Cai, and Lai Chau with 22 KIIs and 50 CAP surveys. And these surveys were disseminated throughout the whole of these countries. So there were some limitations that created some challenges for us. First of all, Myanmar, with the civil unrest, it was agreed with ASEAN about anything further than a literature review. So the literature review was expanded. And the scope of the project, ASEAN Act are actually undergoing a much larger project, incorporating multiple other areas regarding justice. And this was one of them. And so we were limited with the number of sites and the amount of research and data that we were able to gather. But the methodology that we put together, we were very confident, and we're very, very happy with the amount of rich data that we were able to gather. COVID-19, as I say, as you're probably all aware, we had lockdowns, lockups, lock-ins, lockouts. We weren't able to access in person a number of the sites that we really wanted to do on-site field assessments. We weren't able to do in-person stakeholder interviews, which we would have preferred, but we were able to undergo some, and we switched to online. And with data access, rather than being able to take the photographs ourselves and look at documents ourselves and forms, etc., we requested the stakeholders to send them to us instead. Unfortunately, they were not able to send us, for one reason or another, many photographs. This is one of them, one of only about 10 that we received from the stakeholders, which is data in itself, of course. And this is a picture of the Phnom Penh Court of First Instance in Cambodia. The respondent mix, the idea was to get the equal number within each of the 4 stakeholder groups. So 5 from each group was the target. For one reason or another, mostly because of COVID, had put extra strain on the individuals and the organizations. It wasn't possible. So sometimes it was heavily weighted in one stakeholder group than another. But overall, we felt that the data was representative of the actual situation on the ground. And there were some challenges to the actual KIIs. Of note, the official channels and requirements within Lao PDR was such that we were unable to access some of the higher level stakeholders within the time limit that we had. So there were these areas of assessment that were identified: legislation, identification, investigation, prosecution, trial, referral and support services, gender equality and social inclusion, or Jessie, and COVID-19. Now, I'm just going to go over just a couple of the capacity needs that we identified. Obviously, we go into a lot more detail in the consolidated report that is being currently finalised. So with respect to legislation, overall, we did find that the countries were aligned to regional and international obligations. However, there were gaps. We found that the government protocols and guidelines were often broad and imprecise and inconsistent, and this obviously impacts quite significantly on their implementation. The existence of a non-punishment clause, for example, was not well known and not well used, and Asean Act has actually undertaken further research and produced a report on this, which I highly recommend. It is available online. Ages defining sexual consent, marriage, age of majority, and criminal culpability across ASEAN member states was often contradictory within national legislation, and certainly in some cases was not aligned to regional or international legislation. Some of the rights to protection and compensation is not well understood. It can be quite complex and is often therefore ignored, and that obviously impacts on child rights. There is a distinct lack of absence of gender equality and social inclusion, LGBT, disability legislation. And also the other issue is that the judicial systems tend to be very underfunded. And this obviously is a barrier to processing and ensuring children receive justice. Moving on to identification, again, there is a good foundational understanding regarding key factors relevant to identifying children and victims of trafficking. But one of the main significant issues is unconscious biased attitudes. This includes perceptions such as children being willing victims, victim blaming. There's also issues with inconsistencies in differentiating children from adults, understanding the various forms of trafficking in exploitative contexts, understanding the difference between victims and offenders, and properly understanding the age of consent. And of course, all this is directly connected with victim blaming. There's also a critical issue with children's testimonies, credibility being undermined, and that obviously erodes the level of trust between the judicial system and children and their families. Children also experience multi-layered discrimination, including determining factors such as gender, ethnicity, religion, etc. And there's also a necessary confusion between frontline stakeholder groups and their ability to formally identify children. Often it's very bureaucratic, and the number of specific officials allowed to and authorized to identify children is lacking. Looking at investigation, again, standards and protocols are predominantly in place, but there are some critical issues. There are insufficient numbers of specialized frontline stakeholder personnel, and there's also a lack of specialized vocational training in order for them to fulfill their role. There's a gap in the practice and knowledge and attitude of how and when to implement child rights. What does do no harm mean? What are child rights, for example? And also child-friendly facilities are lacking across the board within all frontline stakeholder groups, such as simple things such as recording devices, understanding that children should only be interviewed a minimum number of times by perhaps one investigator. And also there is a gender imbalance favouring males over females amongst all frontline stakeholder groups. And this can create a barrier sometimes for both boys, but predominantly girls, in accessing and feeling comfortable and reassured in accessing the justice system. Looking at prosecution, again, there is a very clear intention amongst all stakeholders, in all stakeholder groups, for perpetrators to be identified, for them to be prosecuted, and for children to achieve justice. However, trafficking cases do remain very complex. And because there is confusion as to which legislation should be applied and when and how, more often than not, sometimes prosecutors feel that they have no alternative but to apply legislation that carry lesser allegations and lesser penalties. And therefore that then benefits the perpetrator and not the child. Again, the same situation in the lack of specialised personnel, also receiving a lack of specialised vocational training. With respect to trials, there is across the board a recognition that children should be treated and dealt with in the judicial system separately from adults. However, because of a lack of child-focused practices and child-friendly facilities, this is often very difficult. It is also inconsistent compared to centralised courts and local and provincial. There are multiple examples of unconscious bias and attitudes, particularly within sensitive cross-examination. Children often coming into contact, physical contact with the offenders at the time of trial and earlier hearings, and a lack of working equipment. So there are no separate rooms for children and no working equipment for them to be questioned separately from the courtroom. There also is an imbalance of male and female gender within the judiciary. Looking at some of the gaps for referral and support services, essential support services do exist, both government and non-government. However, there is an imbalance and there is a heavy weighting that the government do rely more on non-governmental that really should be within the responsibility and accountability of the government. Of course, as many of you know, the organisations are woefully underfunded. The personnel are overworked. The interagency referral mechanisms are often very weak. They're not consistent. They're not uniform. And there is a lack of awareness as to what services are needed and when. And sometimes they're not provided throughout the whole journey through from start to trial. Also, there is an issue of juvenile offenders and victims being treated differently, where juvenile offenders do not receive the support that they also need. There is also a disconnect between the judicial system and children, the support they receive, so that sometimes children don't even know when their trial is and they don't attend court. And so sometimes cases are dropped. Looking at some of the gaps for Jessie, it's just missing across the board. Legislation is missing for LGBTQI, for disability, and for Jessie. There is a lack of awareness. There's a lot of prejudice that exists around it. And again, there's a distinct gender imbalance amongst officers. And lastly, looking at COVID-19, as you know, there were significant delays throughout the whole of the judicial system, leading to massive backlogs now that are going to take years to try and clear, and a lack of emergency protocols. So what we then did was we took these findings And we then looked at identifying specific technical areas that we could then build around capacity strengthening frameworks, as I say, both on a national as well as a regional basis. And we identified 6 technical areas: coordination, administration, and implementation, capacity training, policies and procedures, institutional development, data management, monitoring, and evaluation. So the first was coordination, administration, and implementation. And we looked at what and how these could be implemented, and specifically by which stakeholder group, or could we spread it amongst commonly within the stakeholder groups. So firstly, we looked at government and ministerial stakeholder group. And the first thing that we identified was underfunding. This was no surprise. So we simply recommended that more money was to be allocated. Easily said than done, obviously. But we wanted to be more specific as to where and how that money could be best spent. So the first thing that we recommended was that investments needs to be increased in all frontline stakeholder groups, but personnel. Increase the number of personnel, increase the number of female personnel, increase their training, increase the equipment that they can have access to. So building up IT, for example, looking at alternative access to evidence gathering, but also looking at protection of personnel. Looking at indicators for self-care to prevent burnout. The next was to increase investment in the provision of child-friendly equipment and the establishment of judicial models. Now, when we say judicial models, we found a couple of examples of ideal shelters or an ideal courtroom that was specifically for children with their best interests in order to prevent or at least mitigate any further traumatization. And some of these were identified, and what we would like, what we've recommended, is that more of these models are identified throughout the region in order for them to be replicated and upscaled. So child-friendly equipment would include, for example, rooms that children can feel safe in, they feel protected, in order to start establishing that level of bond and trust to enable to question them sensitively, to elicit the information that they needed to establish and gather evidence against their perpetrators. The third was financial support to provide essential support services. So we're looking at here at looking at the full broad range of the support services. So looking at providing a representation, a social worker, right from the outset, as soon as a child has been identified, to be provided with that support for them and their family or guardians, and then for that to continue consistently throughout the journey, throughout the judicial system. That also includes shelters, psychological counselling, etc. And also financial support for the child and their families. As you know, more often they can be trafficked across borders, and they have to stay in that country in order to fulfill the judicial process. How do they live? How do they exist? Where do they stay? Can they work? So looking at providing visas and potential job opportunities. And looking at the government and ministerial stakeholder groups to provide the funding for the structure of training and workshops. So we're looking at not just a tick box exercise. We're looking at providing a structure for they can provide training, so there is a definitive change in attitudes and behavior. And so learning can actually be implemented in practice. And one of the ideas I'll come on to discuss shortly is the communities of practice, looking at sharing best practices, not just within those stakeholder groups, but across the frontline stakeholder groups. So the second technical area is capacity training, and looking at the extent and nature of those trainings and by which stakeholder group. So we identified multiple training modules. These are just some of them. And some were specific to the stakeholder groups, which I'll come on to shortly. But there were many training modules that actually all stakeholder groups, including government and policymakers, would benefit from. And these are some of them. So having more of awareness of the relevant international, regional, and national child rights and trafficking legislation, and the guidelines and protocols that are currently in place. But also not just an awareness, how that can be applied to their roles. Understanding do no harm. What does that mean? How does that change the way that you perform your job? Understanding morals and ethics and the best interests of the child. What does that mean? How can you understand what the best interests of the child are? Asking the child, discussing with the child, not just presuming that they need to be told what to do, but asking what they need, what is best for them as well. Being aware of child, Jessie, and disability awareness and sensitivity. So this would look at interviewing, the types of questions that are asked, when they're asked, who they're asked by, where they're being asked, for example. And also the referral mechanisms. So it's not just from the police and immigration that are asking them and social workers, but this includes medical staff, and being aware that girls and sometimes boys may not want to be examined by a male doctor. They may want to be examined by a female doctor, a female nurse, for example, and for medical staff to be aware of being treating a child differently and with additional sensitivity, particularly understanding that they have been severely traumatized. Another one of the training modules that we felt was really critical was professional and personal self-care. I just touched on this earlier. The understanding that frontline personnel from the three frontline stakeholder groups, they experience dealing with very traumatized children, dealing with very traumatized situations on a daily basis. This causes them trauma as well. And to understand that and to be able to prevent or mitigate, as well as dealing with any potential issues of burnout, needs to be identified, not just by themselves, but by their managers. And looking at how that can be done, looking at what organizations can do to prevent and then to support personnel. Looking at database systems and IT advancements, so training on equipment, new equipment, processes, and cybersecurity. And this also is in light of the growing number of online exploitation of children and how that can be countered. And at the application of collaboration and coordinated responses at the national and regional level. So looking at sharing practices, so to try and change the existing current siloed way that many individuals and organizations and departments will currently work, and to open up and to share their practices so that this can encourage collaboration. Because many NGOs have a very excellent insight into counter-trafficking and the ways to deal with children that can benefit police, for example, and immigration officers. So everyone benefits. Everyone benefits in the way that they practice. Everyone benefits in the way that children can access and receive the best care, the best support, and in achieving data that can be used to counter trafficking. Then we looked at specific training modules for specific stakeholder groups. And so, for example, for higher level government, ministerial, policymakers, managers, we looked at specific modules for leadership and executive training. And this is where fundamental change in behavior and attitudes can change. And if these can change at the top, then it will have a trickle-down effect. And this is really key to being self-aware as to any unconscious bias that can then impact on your behavior and practices. And to look at partnering with private sector best practices. Look at what is happening in the private sector. What are those best practices? Adopt them and replicate them for that context. We then looked at specific training for law enforcement, judiciary, and support and referral stakeholder groups. So again, there are many. These are just a few. So specialized vocational training for in-depth practical implementation of child, Jessie, and disabled awareness and child-sensitive approaches and facilities. So not just, again, this tick box exercise, not just this kind of learning, oh, okay, I've got to do another hour or a workshop over a weekend, but at least we get, you know, a nice, delicious lunch. Looking at how you can learn from that, what can you take away in order to be able to implement it practically in your day-to-day role? So looking at how that information can be retained and applied. So some of the recommendations that we've made are establishing communities of practice. So within NGOs or within the police or within immigration, what are the problems that you're having? What are the challenges? And how are you overcoming those challenges, and to share those practices? What is working and to share it, but then to share it across between the other frontline stakeholder groups. If it benefits you, it may very well benefit someone else working in a different field within the justice system. Looking at also coaching, mentoring, and apprenticeships, not just pre-qualification into your role as a police officer, immigration, or social worker, but looking at how that can continue throughout your career. People who have retired, for example, can provide excellent coaching and mentoring. So the third area we looked at and identified was policies and procedures. And we identified areas of legislation and literature that did need to be reviewed, and recommendations on how to revise them. And the first way would be to improve interagency referral. Look at how cases are being referred, why are some cases not being referred, and to look at the forms and the awareness of groups and NGOs and services that can be provided and are available. Sometimes some of these stakeholders were not aware that children had these needs and that these needs could be fulfilled and supported. So that was really, really important. And what we would advise would be to have a workshop between these frontline stakeholder groups to look at how cases are being referred and to streamline that process, and to ensure that the forms that are being used, documentation that's being required, is consistent and uniform. How can stakeholder groups contribute to a legislative review? So be aware as to the next time that policymakers are looking to review and revise legislation, and for the policymaking stakeholder group to make it aware and open it out to other stakeholder groups for their input. And again, this can be a working group. Of course, as ever, everything needs to be gender mainstreamed. Again, not just from a gender perspective, but with all determining factors: Jessie, disability, LGBT, ethnicity, religion. All documents need to have this holistic approach. And of course, COVID-19, looking at emergency procedures, not just specifically for COVID-19, which isn't going to go away, but that can be a flexible approach to other potential emergencies, such as climate change. Institutional development, we looked at areas for structural, organizational capacity development. So for government ministerial stakeholders, they would have responsibility for looking at how they can strengthen their organization and resilience. And again, this harks back to strengthening their personnel, looking after their personnel, preventing their burnout, ensuring that they are supported, setting up confidential, free counselling, referrals, and support, for example. Increasing female personnel throughout all stakeholder groups on all levels. Again, the interagency models, identifying these, identifying where they are, why are they models, and replicating and upscaling them. Appropriate age assessments, looking at how to assess the age of a child and understanding that sometimes physical examinations are not scientific, don't have any scientific basis, and certainly eradicating the procedure of internal examinations on female children. That should be stopped. And looking at alternative, so looking at gathering evidence by speaking to the child, speaking to their friends, family, colleagues, etc. Streamlining victim identification, looking at the system, looking at the bureaucracy that's involved, simplifying it, and increasing the number of personnel who are able to formally identify a victim, and that it not necessarily just be a police officer, for example, it could be a social worker. Increase and improve child-focused facilities, so looking at where these facilities need to be provided and how they are provided, and the availability and the accessibility, making sure that these are available. Expediting trials and judgments. So we propose that cases involving children, whether they're juvenile offenders, victims, witnesses, are then pulled out and then fast-tracked, not just for the trial process, but also in receiving judgment. Looking at, again, internal collaboration, sharing best practices, looking at networking, not just within your stakeholder group, but across the stakeholder group, across the country, but also across the region, and looking at international, what is working in other areas of the world? Can it be implemented in your situation, in your country? And also for COVID-19 equipment to be provided to prevent the spread, not just for your own personnel, but also for victims and offenders. Looking at data management and looking at the types and forms and structures of data and databases. Looking at upgrading the current systems that you have. Again, not just within your department or stakeholder group, but across all stakeholder groups. So looking at ensuring that all information is recorded, that it's properly disaggregated, not just based on gender, but all information is in there, that it's confidentially recorded, and that it can be shared, ensuring, of course, that it is kept confidential. So we're looking here also at using this data to look at changing trafficking patterns, looking at how trafficking routes have changed. What is their commonality in order to gather evidence that would benefit all stakeholder groups. Providing secure portals for children and families to check their case progress. Again, there was this distinct disconnect between the judicial system and the child as they're waiting for their case to be heard. And often than not, they're missing important hearings and trials. So allowing children and their families to access that information and ensuring that that information is updated for them to check. Looking internationally at best practice databases. Again, what is working? Where is it working? Can it be implemented? Can it be replicated? Can it be upscaled? And again, looking at the business sector, looking at the private sector and IT companies, obviously ensuring confidentiality, but engage them. And the sixth technical area was monitoring and evaluation. This was predominantly missing across all stakeholder groups. So these are some of the recommendations that we made. Monitor the implementation and participation of staff with the training modules and programs that are currently being rolled out. What is working, what's not? Are staff not really being engaged? Is it, again, this tick box exercise? Okay, job done. Okay, I can get back to my job or my lunch or whatever. But for them to be fully immersed in training that benefits them, benefits their role. Allowing anonymous feedback on how to improve the judicial systems, not regarding it as a criticism, but regarding it as an opportunity to improve. Individual and organizational accreditation, look at championing individuals, look at championing organizations, and then learning from them and sharing those best practices. Allowing NGOs to monitor and support existing judicial processes. So again, not seeing this as a critical observation. They are there to help, they are there to support, and often have very technical insights that can be missed by other frontline stakeholder groups. So see it as more collaborative and positive to achieve the best justice outcome, judicial outcome. Regional forums, not just regional forums though, community forums that engage children to learn from them. And then for this to be spread and shared of their insights into how the judicial system can be improved. And we also recommended further research that would include more sites within the countries that we've already assessed, more countries to be assessed, more interviews, more surveys, looking at different areas to be researched, such as the needs of juvenile offenders, looking at male victims as well, and many other recommendations for research. So the next steps, the report has been finalized. We're looking at just the final stages before it can be published, which is later on this year, and then looking at the report being translated into the national languages of the 7 countries that were assessed. There has been an ACWC forum, which I've already presented at, and the frameworks have been reviewed, and Asean confirmed that the national level capacity strengthening frameworks have been taken on board and will form part of their 2023 work plans centered around child justice. And also the ACWC want to focus on online exploitation, which multiple findings and recommendations will benefit from. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy now to, we've got about 15 minutes. I'm happy to field questions. But actually, I'm also very interested to learn and get feedback from you and any insights into your best practices and any other challenges that you consider still need to be addressed. I'll have a look at the chat box here. So let's have a look at this. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you participating. Okay, so yes, I'm very happy to share the presentation. I've already sent a copy of the PowerPoint. I think maybe Joseph could support with that. Okay, he said that the presentation is available. Okay, great. How do you recommend organizations develop sustainable collaboration with government departments? Again, the communities of practice, creating your own forums. This could be online. It depends on where you are geographically. So online may be the best way forward. And setting up forums yourself, making sure that they're confidential and literally inviting people to join. within your stakeholder groups, but across all stakeholder groups. Contact them, explain what you're doing and why you're doing it, that you want to share best practices, you want it to be a learning environment and a safe learning environment. Again, it's not meant to be critical. Everyone can empower everyone else with their own insights, and to be professional about it. That's what we're trying to encourage, is collaboration and support. I hope that helps. Yeah, again, the same point. Yes, government officers can be, let's say, reticent to participating. But having said that, we spoke to numerous government officers who were very open and very willing to participate in the assessment, and who do want to collaborate. And it is just being able to identify them, again, reaching out, asking them if they want to participate. And actually you find that many do. Who has the responsibility of maintaining and ensuring clean data on the system? This is something I think that you need to review in-house. How is it being done already? There should be safeguard systems in place to ensure that the data that's being recorded is already confidential, but there should be people engaged, sort of an IT department, or people, individual IT experts that would have that role to ensure that the data is there and to monitor it. So that is part of the monitoring and evaluation system that needs to be established. What are some of the leading practices in feeding back anonymously to improve judicial systems? That I can't comment on at the moment. And that is something that needs to be looked at further. Again, this can form part of the communities of practice. This can be something that can be discussed. And also, again, one of our recommendations was engaging the private sector and looking at businesses and how they are able to receive information anonymously. Perhaps you could set up a safe portal, email portal, that you could receive anonymous information from. I hope that helps. What are the roles of governments developing partners to be involved with human trafficking issues besides only the service support? It's a very good question. And it's not something that I can comment on at the moment, but certainly is an area that needs to be developed within the government. And again, it forms part of our recommendations for them to look at how they can collaborate in a more effective way, and to be more transparent in the way that they operate. Obviously, there are going to be issues that some governments in some countries are going to be more reticent to do that. But again, there just needs to be reassurances that collaboration doesn't mean undermining someone or undermining a department, and that the goal is to counter trafficking. The goal is to support and protect potential victims and actual victim survivors. Okay, so Wendy Morris, we have children's homes and day centres. Would it be helpful for our staff to do audit interviews with children to get random reports on what their experience is in our programmes? Might that give our staff some experience in recognising concerns? I think that might be a very good idea. Certainly, as long as all ethical considerations are followed. Obviously, best interests of child and do no harm. Children are often misunderstood in the sense that they are presumed not to have their own minds and opinions. And certainly, depending on their age, they have their own minds and opinions. And they have a lot more insight than often adults give them credit for. And they are, I would recommend, the first people to go to speak to about their experiences and how things could be improved. So I think that would be a really great idea, and it encourages them to be empowered, to participate, and for them to feel that they've contributed to their own benefit, but also potentially to other children's benefit. I think would be an incredible improvement and an incredible contribution. Am I part of the UN Cluster Network? I have consulted for the UN for various UN departments. It's my experience with system and collaboration. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can come down to individuals rather than departments, and I feel that that can be done on a dual basis. There can be a lot of bureaucracy involved, and I think that being able to cut through that bureaucracy, and again, choosing people who are willing to do that, choosing people who are willing to collaborate, is the best way forward, and to creating those forums. And certainly, you know, one individual, it can snowball. So that's what we can do. You know, in our line of work, we face obstacles every day, in a myriad of ways. But we need to start somewhere. And more often than not, it can start with you. Okay, we have a few more minutes for a few more questions, or you know, please let me know some of your best practices. You know, can you share some insights as to how you have overcome some of the challenges that that we experience and that frontline personnel experience in child justice in ASEAN and further afield? Are any of you part of an online forum? I came across, I've done a lot of research in Thailand. I was based in Thailand for 12 years. And I heard of a group of female detectives who created their online WhatsApp group, because many of them had to work in their own time on cases of abuse and trafficking. And so they created their own WhatsApp group. And that's how they were able to share instances of abuse, potential common perpetrators, and managed to achieve some very good results. It is an ongoing challenge. Yes, I think it will be for some time. Yeah, but you know, even small changes can have a great impact. Yep, using Telegram. Telegram is very useful in Cambodia. It's very common in Cambodia, and WeChat. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And it's also useful for local and provincial areas that often don't have a lot of coverage. Yeah. Human trafficking is not only destination countries, but also transit countries. Yes, absolutely. They're very much on a route of the trafficking phenomenon. So that what are the main key interventions for being together to end this? That's that's $1 million question. I mean, there are multiple interventions along the way, and again, it's there's no one answer to that. It is and it should be a collaborative approach. You can't continue to work in a siloed way within as an individual or at a department or a stakeholder group. So the police working on their own will never be able to achieve and counter trafficking and protect the victims and prevent trafficking. You need to be part of a system, and that's what we keep recommending. You know, you need to understand that you are part of a system. Yes, I have seen government learn from private sector. Yeah, there have been some best practices in some leadership training and also with respect to IT and databases. So yes, it has happened. Some practices. All the staff volunteers are given awareness on child protection policy and even make them sign. Yeah, signing child protection policies is a very good way of awareness raising. And awareness raising is obviously very critical, but obviously looking as well as how that can be implemented. What are the consequences of not understanding about child protection policy? How can that be turned into practical awareness? How can you be more self-aware as to your unconscious biases? Many people are just not aware that they may have a certain bias, and that then feeds into practices that may cause harm. So that's what we're looking at sort of fundamental transitional change, looking at what your unconscious biases are, and then leading to a behavioral change. Oh, great. From Santi Tarragon, we help government establish child assemblies to talk about child protection. That's fantastic. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. Looking at across the board, not just from child assemblies, on a local level, on a provincial level, on a national level, on a regional level. Get children involved. You know, whether they've been a victim or not, children have a good insight. Children talk to each other. And they may know someone who is a victim survivor and can then pass on that information and that insight. What types of vocational trainings are being provided? Is that the question? There are multiple. It depends on who is providing it and how and when and where. But certainly we are actually part of trainings across the region, looking at supply chains at the moment. But it is something that we are looking at building as an organization. So looking at sort of constructive, practical training that can be implemented on a day-to-day basis. The UN are providing, but that is something else that Asean Act is also looking at as a result of these findings and capacity building frameworks. And we're very much looking forward to continuing our partnership with them and for those to be rolled out. Okay, we have 1 minute left, so I think that's coming to the end of the session. Thank you very much for all your questions. Thank you very much for your active participation in this session. Thank you for listening. I am contactable on my email there. It's Jennie@embode.co. And I look forward to meeting with you and working with you in the future. Thank you so much.